Our second reading is from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 17, verses 1 through 8. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. There he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as light. Just then there appeared before them Moses and Elijah, talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, a bright cloud covered them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell face down to the ground, terrified. But Jesus came and touched them. "Get up," he said. "Don't be afraid." When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
In chapter 16, Jesus has just told the disciples that it is time that they prepared to go to Jerusalem. He's beginning to get them ready for the suffering of the Passion, for the time when what has been spoken of by the prophets is going to be fulfilled. And I think the transfiguration that happens in our reading is an important step in this process. Because through the transfiguration of the apostles, they will be able to see clearly, to understand who Christ really is. So our first verse says, after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. So who is this Peter guy? You know, he was the head of the apostles, and he was the rock upon which Christ would build the foundation of his church. And then James and John. These guys, Jesus had given them a name. It was Boanerges. And Boanerges in Greek means sons of thunder. And you wonder, why would he give a name, sons of thunder, to a couple of brothers? Maybe because they were really good speakers and they could bring the message to the people. But Jesus takes them there for a reason. It was to open their understanding. And then verse 2 tells us, there he was transfigured before them. What does transfigured mean? I mean, how was he changed? In spite of the dictionary definition, I don't think Jesus is changed in essence, but only in appearance, so that they could get an idea of who Jesus really is. You know, after a while, your surroundings, you get used to seeing the same things over and over, the same people, and sometimes you don't see what is special about that place. Now, when my wife and I lived in Seattle, I used to, every Saturday morning, go for a bike ride, 25, 30 miles. And one of the places I liked to go was around Mercer Island. And it was a beautiful bike ride. I mean, on one side you had all of these trees and, just great, big, beautiful pines. And on the other side, as you're riding around the island, you can see Lake Washington all around you as you go. And then there's this nice cabins or beautiful homes all around, and this winding trail with little hills, and on a bicycle, it's just a beautiful ride. Well, after I'd done that 5 or 10 times, it was like, oh, well, Mercer Island again, same old thing I've seen over and over again. And so I come up, I'm riding along thinking, how can I spruce this journey up a little bit? And I thought, you know what, next corner that I come to, I'm going to look around that corner, and the first thing I see, I'm going to remember that for the rest of my life. So I come around that corner, and the first thing that catches my eye is a sign on the side of the road. Not just a sign, but the back side of a sign, so I can't even read it. And it's like this arrow pointing up a hill, and that's about it. That's what I see. So I remember that to this day. Probably will remember that till the day I die. But, that was like an arrow pointing to something that I was missing. I'd stopped seeing the beautiful trees. I had stopped seeing the lake all around me. I had stopped seeing the road and those houses and then the great time that I was having. And so now whenever I see the backside of a sign, that's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking, gosh, I'm missing so much, So that is the kind of thing that Transfiguration does for us. It allows us to see things that are just normal, but see the reality behind them. And in the same way, the apostles have been seeing Jesus every day, right? They've eaten with him, they walk with him, they've seen him tired, they've seen him do the mundane things that we humans do every day. And they need some kind of a sign to remind them of just how precious Jesus is. They need a sign to truly see and to truly understand. And what does this sign look like? Well, the rest of verse 2 says, his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as light. Well, when we think of something being as bright as the sun, when we think about the sun itself, what are we thinking of? What does the sun do for us? It provides light. Jesus provides light, right? It provides us energy. Everything that is on this planet that grows, anything that has energy on this planet, all that energy ultimately comes to us first through the sun. And you know what? The sun's out there, it's got gravity, and what's happening? Earth's revolving around it, right? Well, Jesus is just like all of those things if you think about it. Jesus is the energy that drives us. Jesus is the being around which we circulate our lives. Brings us warmth, brings us love, makes us who we are. Without the sun, what is the planet? What is the earth? It's just a big rock floating out in space. It doesn't revolve. It just stays out there. But with the sun, it's got all of these things, all of this life on it. Well, that's what Jesus is for us. Without Jesus, we are lifeless. And verse 3 tells us, just then there appeared before them Moses and Elijah, and both of them are talking to Jesus. And who is this Moses guy, right? Well, Moses is this Old Testament figure, and he's the one that led the Israelites out of Egypt, brings them to the promised land. And he wrote the 5 books, at the beginning of the Bible. They call the 5 books of the law, the Pentateuch. So there we have Moses, and who else is with him but Elijah? And who's this guy, Elijah? He was the premier among the prophets. And if we think about it, those two represent a lot about the Old Testament. We've got Moses, we got that Pentateuch, the law, and we got the prophets. And there's something else interesting about these two characters, because Moses must have been raised from the dead in order to be present, because when he is taking the Israelites to to the promised land, he stops on Mount Nebo, and God says, you are not allowed to enter the promised land, and he actually dies on Mount Nebo, never entering the promised land. So God had to raise him up to be there present for Jesus at this point. And then how about Elijah? I don't know how many of you know the story of Elijah. Elijah got this, his successor or protege, his name was Elisha. And Elijah knows at a certain point that he's going to die, or he's going to be leaving the earth. And he doesn't tell Elisha, he just keeps trying to get away from him. But Elisha knows something's up because somebody's told him that Elijah is going to be leaving. And he doesn't want to let him go, so he follows him around every minute. And finally Elijah just gives up and says, okay, now you're going to see what's going to happen. So chariot comes down from the heavens, and Elijah gets on it, boom, goes off into the sky. So Elijah is one of the few figures from the Old Testament that is actually lifted up and raised up and never dies. So think about this. You've got this process. You've got Moses rising from the dead, right? And you've got Elijah going up to heaven. Is this a prefigure of what is going to happen to Jesus? Maybe a little bit of foreshadowing there. So Peter said, to the Lord, or says to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." But as usual with Peter, and you'll really find this is true in the Gospel of Mark, he's kind of on the wrong track, trying to figure out, what he should be doing. But Christ's power is not stationary, but is always on the move. And Jesus pretty much ignores Peter's comment. And while Peter is still speaking, saying what he wants to do here, and this goes to speak to the whole idea that, make a plan and God's going to change it for you. Yeah. Peter's made this plan. He doesn't even get to finish making the sentence about what he's planning on doing. So while he was still speaking, a bright cloud covered them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my Son whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." Now, what does this scene remind you of? And if you think back about Jesus' baptism, when John the Baptist is there, what happens? The sky opens up, and God says, "This is my Son with whom I am well pleased." And the Spirit comes out of the sky like a dove and lands on Jesus. And this kind of brackets his career. You got this beginning where Jesus' career really begins with his baptism. And now you've got the beginning of the denouement of the end. So, God says, listen to him. And the listen to him part is really important because, so we've got Moses with the law. We've got Elijah, the prophet, and then we've got Jesus. Okay, and who does God say to listen to? God says, listen to Jesus, right? So, the law is important, yes. And the prophecies are telling us that Christ is coming. But who are we going to obey? Who are we going to listen to when we are trying to figure out how to live our lives, how to grow our faith? We're going to listen to Jesus. That doesn't mean that everything in this Bible is not important. Because if you look, the law, Jesus fulfills the law. And we find out that in another passage in Matthew. And we also find Jesus is the fulfillment of all of those prophecies. And so all of those things are important. But since we've got all that Christology in the Old Testament, and now we've got Jesus, who we can understand what he says by all of the writings and the sayings that he has in the Gospels, and we can see what Paul has to say, and it gives us a degree of theology about it. So now we find out that Christ is in the whole Bible. Christ is the fulfillment of the law. Christ is foretold in the prophets, and Christ is there. So this whole thing is about Christ. Verse 6 tells us, when the disciples heard this, they fell down to the ground, terrified. So they're seeing God. Actually, they don't even look because they're afraid to look. So, but why would anyone be afraid of God, you think? So, if you look in the Old Testament, you read some of those passages, you see that sometimes when people see God, they die, and also, or just get near and touch the Ark of the Covenant. That was enough for somebody to die. And even Moses feared the Lord, and if you think about the burning bush, the reason God presented himself to Moses in the burning bush is because he knew that Moses would be afraid to gaze on God, and this was his way of representing himself to Moses. So God was seen as this figure of retribution. This was a God to be feared, right? So then verse 7 tells us, but Jesus came and touched them. Get up, he said, don't be afraid. So what is Jesus doing? We've got this transference from Old Testament fear of God to our God here on earth, Jesus Christ, giving us comfort and love, comforting people. Maybe this is the true transfiguration that we should be looking at. We've got this transference from this powerful God that shoots down lightning on people to this loving God, this smiling God. And the other day, Robin and I went to Turning Brook, and we visited Bar Meek. And she was talking to us about this picture she has that she really loves, and she looks on it all the time. She's got it in her bedroom. And it's the laughing Jesus. And it's just this beautiful image of Christ, not being this austere, fierce character, but being this loving God who is with us all the time, who brings us joy, who brings us love. So when verse 8 comes along, and he says, when they looked up, and this is the apostles, they saw no one except Jesus. All of that austerity, all of that fear that they had is suddenly gone. And now they're actually seeing Jesus in a new light. As you know, we are made in the image of God. In effect, the image of Christ. As Paul tells us in his epistle, because Christ died and then rose, because Christ ascended into heaven, we too will rise and ascend on that judgment day. I also think that like Christ, we too will be transfigured. You know, when the apostles saw Christ changed, they saw the light of Christ. They saw Jesus as he really is. The apostles were used to seeing Jesus every day. To their eyes, Jesus may have seemed somewhat ordinary. But when Jesus was transfigured, they were strikingly reminded of who Jesus is. The transfiguration did not change Jesus in any tangible way. It only made clear what was already true, that Jesus is the Messiah, that Jesus is God, that Jesus is love. Yes, they knew it before, but this revelation made that reality palpable. It allowed them to see it and feel it down into their very souls. In that same way, we too will be transfigured when we go to heaven. Our faces will shine. We will glow with the love of Christ that has already transformed us from within. So this image is a revelation to others of the light of Christ that is already in us. We already glow within ourselves. We can already feel the warmth of God's love. We can already feel the benefit of being made in the image of God. And you know, it's not just us as individuals. It is every person that we see in this sanctuary. It is every person that we meet on the street. It is all of God's children, all of us who inherit the kingdom of heaven. So when you greet each other with a sign of peace at the end of the service, or talk to someone during fellowship time, or even when you're just chatting with someone as you're standing in line at the grocery store, look closely at that person and think, maybe get a glimpse of that light of Christ that is within them and within each and every one of us. Let us pray. O God, our Father, you have blessed us with the light of your love. Open our eyes that we may see your work in this world. Lord, it is through your love that we are transformed. Let us also be transfigured in a way that reveals to the world that we are your people and you are our God. Amen.